my name is Dr. Laura McCusker. I am the Assistant Director of Educational Services here at Lincoln Intermediate Unit 12. My background is as a classroom teacher for 9 years before I came to the intermediate unit to work in literacy staff development. And since I've been here, I've grown into a leadership role. Currently, one of my roles is as the point of contact for equity for our 3-county region. And so I work in PDE initiatives on equity. I also work in school improvement, as well as different pieces for curriculum instruction and assessment. So I'm thrilled today to be speaking with you about trauma-informed classroom strategies, but I do have to tell you that some of you here have a very diverse background as mine. For example, your counselors, your psychologists that might come at this as more of a clinical background. I'm coming from this from more of a classroom perspective. So I appreciate your grace with me as I continue to learn more and more about this. Hopefully you've had a great day so far talking about behavior. And so we're really going to springboard off of PBIS and look at what of our classroom strategies are really trauma informed and why. So by now you probably know that Act 48 needs to be filled out at the end of each day of our Summer Institute, and that by Friday, you need to fill that in order to get your Act 48 hours. Our norms for the entire conference is asking for engagement, but realizing that it does look different for everyone. So we're so appreciative that you're here. Today, we're going to honor all perspectives, come from a place of your own personal story, and assume good intentions of everyone, because we all want students and our educational system to improve. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here on a beautiful summer day. Again, here is my contact information as well as some of my background. I do have a reading specialist certification, and then I did my dissertation on professional learning. So I am so happy and thrilled to be coming to you from Lincoln Intermediate Unit 12. Very glad about that. Let's start with a bit of a check-in. It's always good to check in with yourself, especially after a full day of Zooming. So find one of those icons that you can relate to and feel free to put it in the chat or unmute, thinking about your personal weather. What does your personal social emotional weather look like right now? Ooh, happy to see a rainbow for sure. Partly sunny, that's how I'm feeling too. I have some things weighing on me, but I really am feeling that the sunshine's gonna come out being with you wonderful folks. Great, so just take some time. Ooh, we even have the sun in there. Someone's got their Zoom icons down. Take this time to check in with yourself. Do some deep breathing, stretch, move in your chair a little bit. Make sure that you're checking in with yourself and feeling good about being here. Thanks for sharing. Our objectives for today are simple. We're going to review what we know about trauma in the developing brain, and then we're also going to consider our role personally in supporting trauma-informed classroom strategies. Now, I do have to tell you that some of you might have seen a very big document that came out yesterday, and I'm very excited, and I was diving through it today, and so I did add some of it into our presentation from Governor Wolf. So we're actually going to start there. That didn't even make it to my objectives because that was a 11th hour change. So if you have not seen it, Governor Wolf released yesterday a trauma-informed Pennsylvania plan, a plan to make PA trauma-informed and a healing-centered state. And so that just came out yesterday. I downloaded it and then uploaded it to my Google Drive. So if you want to look at the 72-page document, I recommend you do that after our time together. But I did pull out some of the pertinent things that I thought most closely relates to the topic we're already here to talk about. So for one thing, very many of us are probably familiar with ACEs, and we're going to talk about ACEs in a little bit. But when we're thinking about ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, there was an original Kaiser study that was conducted that first led to ACEs. And so what we now know to be where we measure the trauma that students have already undergone. And so this first figure that came out was the current state of Pennsylvania ACEs according to 2016. So looking at this, about 35% of our state have had we can see some prevalence of ACEs. So we see a lot of emotional abuse, separated or divorce, alcohol abuse. So when we are administering this over a large N count of about 5,000 individuals, we can see what some of the pieces are that we're dealing with. If it's blue, it's abuse. If it's green, then it's household dysfunction, which were the two categories that the original study worked in. So I thought that was very interesting to think of our current state. The second piece that I want to bring to your attention is with all of the discussion on equity, you might also be familiar with the fact that the ACEs study and consequently all of the work we've been doing in looking at adverse childhood experiences does not account for race and for marginalization. So there are many different pieces that our students are going through, oppression and marginalization, that are not accounted for here. And so in the original Kaiser study, in the sample, you'll notice, for example, let me get my annotation tools out here, that in the original Kaiser study, 79.8, 80% of the participants were white, whereas only 5% of them were Black, 5% of them were Latino, 6% of them were Asian, and 3.7 were other. So what we've done is we've predicated all of this research on the ACEs study, from which we've done lots of other pieces in the field of mental health, on something that was really largely centered around our white population. So what's also interesting is in this trauma-informed PA plan, Governor Wolf's team has put together the Philadelphia census and the Philadelphia sample that they conducted more recently. And so here we can see in their samples, and their N counts are listed here for you, we see a much more representative and much more diverse participant tool. So when I'm thinking about how the answers to this study might be a little bit different than that seminal Kaiser sample, we're going to check it out and see what looks different. So when we look here, now we see that the Kaiser sample, so this was the original study on the right-hand side. And then on the left-hand side, we see Philadelphia's. Let's get a circle here. We can see that there is a much higher toll for physical abuse, substance abuse, emotional abuse. Honestly, every single one of these, except for sexual abuse and emotional neglect, score higher, right? So when we think about those things, we want to make sure that we're also aware of how our current talks about equity and all of the contextual information going on in our country about racism and anti-racism movements really affect some of the literature that we've been working off of as educators for quite some time. So I only bring that into our discussion today because of the way that it just came out yesterday, and we're going to talk about ACEs in just a couple of moments. The last piece that I want to bring to your attention from Governor Wolf's report are 4 levels of a state, and it's really of a continuum of recommendations that they're making. And so they're classifying the work that you're doing in equity and trauma-informed in these 4 areas. So as you listen, I want you to think about which of these best represents my workplace. Okay, so I'm going to give you 4 options, and I want you to think which best fits my workplace. So level 1 is this chart here, trauma aware. In this level, we're looking at awareness and attitudes. We're having discussions about awareness around trauma. Some of the processes in the middle are about thinking about the population that we serve, maybe giving a self-assessment to think about what we might need for trauma-informed. Maybe there's awareness training, or you're given resources or encouraged to learn more. And then we're also looking to explore trauma and how that works out for our system. The way to recognize it, look on the right-hand side, these indicators over here. The way that we can recognize a trauma-aware system is that most of the staff are learning the definition of trauma and its impact. They're beginning to understand their own adversity and trauma. The staff are beginning to recognize their own attitudes and become aware that the way that they understand trauma affects others. So that's a level 1, or what we'd call a trauma-aware system. I'm going to give you 3 more choices. Think about which one best fits for where you work. Level 2. Level 2 is trauma sensitive on that continuum. So it's moving deeper into this state of trauma awareness. Here, we're looking to explore principles of trauma, building consensus around principles, and we're preparing for change. Some of the processes we'd see are that we're talking about it with leadership, we're preparing for change and thinking about our readiness, and we're really looking at reviewing tools and processes for universal screening of trauma that's appropriate, and our entity begins to identify resources that really help our students beyond just universal screening, but what might they need in a tier 2 or a tier 3 trauma work. On the right-hand side, we'd recognize a trauma-sensitive entity if we're having a trauma lens and we begin to apply it. There's trauma training for all staff, including new staff. Basic information on trauma is available to both our staff and our students or our customers. We also have opportunities to learn new trauma-related skills, and their leadership recognizes and responds to compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, some of those secondary trauma pieces within their staff. So that's a level 2. A level 3 would be trauma informed. And so the way that this is being defined from Governor Wolf's plan is we're really looking at change and integration. So here is where we're thinking about the staff rethinking routines they've always done with a lens of equity and trauma informed. So here we see trauma principles kind of applying in staff behaviors, staff supports, self-care, staff development. It starts to become some of the bedrock on which we plan everything else. Within the organizational structure, in a level 3 trauma-informed system, we're examining policies, we're looking at record-keeping systems, maybe our discipline data, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the indicators on the right-hand side, we do a policy review. Staff is using common language around trauma. Organization is merely looking at what services they provide, not only to their students, but also their staff. We make some changes to make sure that our environment is more safe and welcoming. We think about crisis management, and the staff at all levels are really moving forward with this trauma-informed approach. The level 4 and final one is thinking about being healing-centered. So on this continuum, we really focus on now trauma response and healing are at the center and the norms of our entire entity. So here the trauma model is accepted by everyone. We've reviewed it. We've come up with a healing approach. We're really looking at how we can retain our staff and make sure that they're feeling safe, even with any trauma led to them. We're looking at policies and stigma. Human resources is looking at pieces that have to do with trauma. We're advocating for trauma-informed decision-making at all levels. We publicly recognize and talk about trauma-informed care. Some indicators are that we've even put it into our mission statement, our goals, our objectives over time. We have made a commitment to trauma-informed. Our employees, our volunteers, they understand how to incorporate the trauma-informed practice. Our partners do the same. We use data-informed decision-making at all levels, and we think even through the business model. So it's really ingrained wherever we are. So I spent way more time than I would have liked to reading through that, but I think it saved us a little bit of time before having you read it separately. So I'm going to give a poll right now, and this is completely anonymous, but of those 4 levels, how might you classify your place of work? And you can go back and forth on the slides. would you say that it most closely resembles right now a level 1, a level 2, a level 3, or a level 4? There's no right or wrong, just trying to figure out where your system might be. If you've never used the poll in Zoom before, you might need to find it. It will be a window that's a pop-up for you. And in just a moment, I'll close the poll and I'll publish the results so everyone can see it. Some of you are responding in the chat. That's fine as well. All right, it looks like 10 of you have responded to the poll within a minute. Great response time, everyone. Thanks for being with us. I'm going to go ahead and end this poll here and share out the results. It looks like most of us feel that we're in some sort of kind of level 3 where we're currently working. I love that because that means that we're really starting to put together everything we need to make some change. And we're really trying to figure out how trauma is really the bedrock of how we need to start to make more inclusive policies and practices within our systems. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing so much. Okay. So let's move forward then. The two objectives that I said we had for today is think about trauma and the developing brain. And secondly, think about what are the strategies that we can use and how are they trauma informed. So we're going to start with trauma and the developing brain. And I want to say for those of you that came on late, again, I don't come to this work from a clinical background. I come from more the educational side. And so please forgive me and help us learn as we move forward if you have things to share about how you understand how trauma and the developing brain work together. I really like this graphic from Washington because it helps me think about my students as individuals, right? And so Washington State was doing this work where they were thinking about their students and looking at their current levels. And they were saying, well, how do I know what is in front of me when it comes to adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs? And so I was referencing the ACEs study earlier on by Kaiser. And so this was a study that was taken on not to medically find adverse childhood experiences, but it was actually looking at weight loss. And there was a study where we were looking at what some common factors were for folks that had not been losing weight. They had been making great gains, and then all of a sudden, they stopped participating. And the researchers were really looking as to what was happening. And when they dug a little bit deeper, there was a question. There was a question about how much did you weigh at your first sexual encounter? And the participant said 35 pounds. And that changed the entire trajectory of what was happening. Because the more they looked at these participants, they realized that these were folks that had high incidence of sexual abuse, other adverse childhood experiences that have stayed with them for their entire lives. So where weight gain was looked at as something to be lost, really it was a coping mechanism of the overeating and that lack of weight loss for these folks. And so it really changed the entire field and how we talk about trauma today. But getting back to this graphic here, it really helps you think about the statistics of how many students in your classroom have come to you with adverse childhood experiences. So the number 0 here are these students have 0 adverse childhood experiences, where there are students in your class that have had 6 or 8 adverse childhood experiences, which research shows has long-lasting implications, even on the brain as well as lifespan. So let's talk about what the shift is. The shift is taking this idea of what's wrong with you and what happened to how can I help, right? Let's talk a little bit about the brain. So the pieces that we're going to talk about today are the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, right? So the amygdala is this little kind of almond-shaped piece, this really tiny, and our prefrontal cortex is this whole section up here where we're centering on our executive functions, right? And so notice that this matures later in childhood, whereas your amygdala matures in early years of life, right? And so the amygdala is triggered by emotional responses. And so the way that I like to think about this, not being a clinical practitioner myself, is the hand model of the brain. So go ahead, especially if your video is off, you're not going to feel silly doing this, but go ahead and put your thumb into the middle of your palm and then fold your fingers over top of it, okay? This is essentially your brain, okay? So just in that image that I showed you, the prefrontal and the cerebral cortex are your fingers, and your amygdala is your thumb down here, right? Sometimes you'll hear that our amygdala is kind of like our baby gate, because as we know, all of our executive functioning is up here. And what happens is that when we are triggered with trauma, right, we quite literally flip our lid. And the amygdala jumps into action and our cortex is unable to be accessed. The baby gate goes up and we cannot get out of that state where we're just trying to survive. So our executive functioning skills that take higher level thoughts and cognition are inaccessible at the moment. Here's where you can see those fingers are our thinking brain, our upstairs brain, right? Whereas our amygdala here, this is our caveman tendencies. And so imagine that you are camping, and hopefully some of you were able to go camping this summer. And as you're camping, you're outside and you see a bear, right? Immediately, what happens? You flip your lid, your amygdala tells you that you are in danger. And so now you need to decide what to do. You're not doing any of that upper thinking. You're really just responding with your midbrain, your amygdala, your big feelings, right? Well, imagine that that bear comes with you to school. That response to that bear is what you get home every day from work or from school. That is the effect of chronic trauma on our students, right? So take a moment to think about a time that your amygdala hijacked your brain, where you were no longer to think with your more developed pieces, but you really were just thinking on fight, flight reactions, right? And so I want you to think back to what that felt like at a time where you were that scared. And what did you need to do to access your upstairs brain again? To be able to calm down, bring yourself back to a state where you are able to access all of the parts of your brain, right? Does anyone want to share, maybe into the chat, or you can unmute, what's something that you did, if this has happened to you, to bring yourself back to a state of calm? Yeah, definitely at a car accident, this would completely happen, for sure. How did you, if something like this happened to you, you don't have to share the example, but what did you need to do to access your upstairs brain again? How did you move past that feeling? I mean, I'm awful good at wait time, but it is the end of the day and some of you have been on all day. So I'm gonna let this one pass, okay? But this is usually the time where the participants kind of share things, right? The passage of time is certainly helpful. Space away from the scene, right? Removing yourself from that suspenseful situation, absolutely. Thank you. So when we talk about the developing brain, getting back to our students, we want to think about some triggers, right? The trigger would be anything that reminds you of that bear. Even if the bear is no longer there in our campsite example, we could be triggered again because it's a memory of that trauma. In the example that was shared with us, if we ever have a memory of that car accident, right, then that would be a trigger for us. It could be a noise, a smell, a temperature, a physical sensation, a visual scene, something that we see. All of those could be triggers. And if you've worked with students for a while, you know that some common triggers include things like unpredictability, maybe a fire drill, maybe sensory overload, or feeling vulnerable or frustrated, or even really clear moments of confrontation. So if those are things that are going to trigger a student with a history of trauma, right, then once they're triggered, they're going to shift back to and flip their lid, right? They're going to shift back to their downstairs brain or their amygdala. So they go back into that survival mode, even if there's no actual real threat to their safety, because it's a perceived threat for them. And so they're not going to be able to access all of their executive functions. It's a physiological response. It's not a rational cognitive process. It's really not something that they can control. So what happens is you'll see some students react to stress-inducing experiences as if it's life and death, because it's re-triggering the trauma that they've had, right? It's their alarm system that's been built in, hardwired into their brains. So let's take a look at how this might play out. I mentioned earlier flight, fight, and freeze. These are ways that students might act out when they are triggered. Is there anything on this list that surprises you a little bit? I kind of thought that, you know, I wouldn't really think, yeah, I was just going to say acting silly. I was going to say acting silly. Sometimes I wouldn't think of that as kind of a fight reaction. But again, it's a way that they're kind of defending what they're doing as well. Yep, absolutely. We also sometimes see a way that students might react also is perfectionism, which is very difficult then to define as a response to trauma. Okay, so thinking about this, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but think about a student that you know, that maybe you've served or you've had some time with. If we're thinking about this from a trauma lens, with your new perspective, what might you listen for? Or what questions might you ask? Or what feedback might you provide? So I want you we're not going to share this out, but I want you to think about a student that you know, or a circumstance that you were in, and try to think about what might have been happening in the brain of that student from a trauma lens. It changes things a bit, doesn't it? All right. So what do we need to do? In order to help the students that are triggered from trauma, we need to help them calm down from their there and then triggers, which were that history of trauma, to become more present in the here and the now reality. Even if there is no threat currently to them, we have to help communicate to them and make sure that they're understanding that. So what can we do? Well, first we need to be able to notice those signs of distress. So anything on that prior slide is a good thing to watch for that could be a sign of traumatic stress. Then we need to try to connect with the student. And that's why building relationships is so important. But then we redirect that behavior by providing reasonable choices or options for alternative activities. Oftentimes we see students triggered. It was not intentional within our system that we wanted those students to be re-traumatized. That's often an accident or something that was unintentional. So we need to be ready as educators to find what are the ways to de-escalate, right? And then what can happen is after the youth is calm, then we can discuss what happened. In our earlier example, when I asked you about your own amygdala and an experience that you had, two of the answers that I got were that I needed time and I needed space away from that scene of the event before I was able to calm down again, right? And so the same is true for our students. We need to not talk to them at their agitated state, but we need to make sure that we're giving time and space to come back to them afterwards once they've been able to self-regulate. So that leads us into how can we shift the school environment and our classroom practices to respond more effectively to students. I like this quote when we're thinking about equity that brings us to gardening, a metaphor about cantaloupes. Gardening serves as a good metaphor for how we should think about creating conditions in our schools that foster equity. If I want to grow big, beautiful cantaloupes, I know the key is getting the conditions just right. They need sunlight, fertile soil, and the right balance of water. If the cantaloupes don't grow, I don't blame the cantaloupes. When we see equity at work, we have to make sure that we're not taking a deficit view against these students that are already traumatized, that we're recognizing the trauma that they carry, and we're building an environment in which they can thrive. So that takes us to part 2, trauma-informed classroom strategies. Does anyone have questions on the trauma and the brain section or anything you'd like to discuss? Okay, feel free to put it in the chat if you'd like to. Okay, so what I've done here is I've taken 8 strategies that you might already know from any of your work if you've had with PBIS. And so I've put them together based on similarity. And so there are actually kind of 4 groups here. So I'm going to ask you first to reflect on them on your own, and then we're going to be in groups and kind of discussing these pieces. So if you're with me on slide 32, there is a reflection sheet. So I'm going to put this link in the chat. If you are on a computer or a tablet, something that you have a little more space, click on that link. And if you're logged into Google, it will ask you if you want to make a copy of it. This is really a place for you to reflect on your own. You don't have to share this with anybody else. But you'll notice when you hit make a copy, it has all of the strategies on the left-hand side and 3 questions for reflection. They ask, what do you already do? How will you do these current strategies with more intentionality? And what will you add to your classroom management practices? Does anyone need help opening that up? I put the link in the chat, or it's the link that says reflection sheet on slide 32. All right, I'll give everyone a second to get there. If you can't access it, you can feel free to make that chart on your own, or at least pick a spot to take some notes. The other 2 pieces that are here, they're also in your folder for today. So if you wanted to, you could open these other ones in your folder for trauma-informed classroom strategies. But we have a handout on these 8 practices, as well as supplemental material. And supplemental material, let me tell you, it's way more slides than you're ever going to want to print out. So don't print out the supplemental material. But it's for you to browse for more information. So I've, in this supplemental material, Put all of the information on these two strategies in red. Any of the slides that have to do with the next two strategies in green, and so on and so forth. So let's talk through all 8 of these strategies. Again, if you're no stranger to positive behavior interventions and supports, or PBIS, you're going to find things that you probably already do, which is super exciting. However, you'll notice our reflection wants you to think about, what might I do differently, or what might I add to my classroom management? So let's walk through this together. If you need any of the resources I'm looking at, again, they're in the Google Drive folder for this session, or they're all linked into slide 32. All right. Our first strategy is to arrange orderly physical environment. There's a section here on what is the strategy, a section here on further notes on how you might design your classroom. And then on the right-hand side, which is really what the function is of our session here today, is to think about, how does this practice support students impacted by trauma, right? So by setting up an orderly physical environment, it allows the teacher to monitor all the students, and so students feel more safe and predictable routines that will come to them. We also want to consider traffic patterns to avoid disruptive students or infringing upon personal space, because as we know, those could be some triggers for some of our students that have been traumatized in the past. The last box here speaks of rationale for the strategy, increasing on-task behavior, perceptions of safety, personal space, et cetera, et cetera. If I move over to this big slide deck of supplemental information, I can see that arranging a classroom, an orderly physical environment, I even have some sample layouts here of how I might put desks. I know this fall we probably have zero choice on how the desks go in our room, but it's important to think about how different layouts have different pieces to them. The second strategy that I would link together with that one is to provide multiple opportunities to respond. This is a class management strategy, but it also is trauma informed. Multiple opportunities to respond is a really helpful formative assessment for the students, because it allows them to engage in a way where they feel safe or not threatened. It also helps improve the accuracy of some formative assessment if we give students multiple opportunities to respond. It also lets the neural networks to be strengthened. I was doing a session yesterday on vocabulary where we talked about a word needs to be really shown and given 17 times for students before they really start to understand that new vocabulary. So by having a physical, orderly classroom and providing multiple opportunities to respond, we're honoring the trauma-informed and trauma-impacted students that are in our classrooms, and we're helping them to be more successful. Questions or comments on either of these two strategies? Now is a good time for you to fill in your own organizer that you're using to take notes. So you can reflect on, what do you already do? And how will you do these current strategies with more intentionality, and what might you add? If I look at that supplemental information, you can see that I have more resources here for you on multiple opportunities to respond anywhere where there's that same icon. All right, let's keep moving. The next two that I've grouped together are to define, teach, and acknowledge rules and expectations, and to define, teach classroom routines. So rules, expectations, and routines. So if I look at the first, how is this practice supporting students that are impacted by trauma? basically we know this, that unpredictability can be a trigger, right? And so by having very clear rules, we can help with that. High expectations also show students that have been trauma impacted that they are very capable and they are worthy of what's happening within that classroom. We also see a piece with consistency here that it really helps. School provides a large piece of routine that students thrive upon. That's why COVID has been so disruptive to so many of our families, right? So having consistent classroom expectations helps with that predictability and gives them some security in what to expect from every day. If I move down here to the resource on defining and teaching classroom routines, again, we see very similar justification. When we provide those clearly defined routines and procedures, helps reduce the stress of the unknown for our students. We also are able to help students self-regulate by giving them routines that they're very familiar with. We can specifically help them with regulation, relationships, self-awareness. So think about maybe how you could do those things within your classroom for your students. As far as more slides, more information, we're looking to these green pieces here. So here's an example of a classroom matrix where very clearly we don't just say the words be responsible in my classroom. We know that be responsible means these things. So it's clearly defined for students. It doesn't leave room for subjectivity. So here are a few classroom matrices. And here are some great example classroom rules that are more specific. You can think about lessons that you might be using to teach skills such as self-regulation, using cues for transitions. And then here are some help with that regulation, relationships, and self-awareness pieces. Questions or comments on either of those two strategies? We can reflect in our chart on what we've learned about these two strategies. All right, keep on going. Our next pairing is to employ active supervision and provide specific praise for behavior. So let's look at how employing active supervision is trauma informed, right? So maintaining active supervision provides that sense of safety for your students. If you're continually scanning the environment, it's more likely that you would be able to sense a trigger prior to it happening in order to sometimes prevent some problem behavior, or look out for the students that you know may be triggered by particular pieces. Active supervision also gives us a place to really build those relationships, which we know are so important for a triggered students in order to self-regulate and de-escalate. If I look down at providing specific praise for behavior, this is trauma informed because it's building students' self-esteem and positive sense of self, which our trauma impacted students may need. It also helps teach new skills. If they're kind of expecting some behavior specific praise, it allows for a sense of control around their environment and then also promotes good brain development. It is worth noting that the recommended ratio of 4 to 1, or is this here, or 5 to 1, which I've heard before, to error correction is even higher for students impacted by trauma. Because they have had a lack of predictability, right? We want to make sure that our error correction ratio is even higher to praise. So go ahead and put any thoughts that you have or reflections into your organizer. What do you already do? How will you do these strategies with more intentionality? And what will you add to your classroom management practices? Looking at the bonus supplemental material, anything in yellow here is extra information for you. So here are some examples of how you can move to do that active supervision. 15 seconds is long enough to have a meaningful connection with the student. That's such good research to hear, considering we have so many students every single day. Here's a specific 5-step pieces on how to provide specific praise for behavior. And we'll move on to our next set. Our next set of strategies are continuum of response strategies for inappropriate behavior, as well as a class-wide group contingency. So a continuum of response strategies for inappropriate behavior is trauma-informed because strategies need to empower the student and teach resiliency skills. We want to give them error correction on an increasing scale so that we're not overcorrecting students because of their trauma. Some students may never really have had the right processes and responses, and so sometimes we need to even reteach some skills to our students. So by giving them a continuum of responses, we're helping them regulate their own emotions, and we're also providing staff the opportunity to build those relationships. The class-wide group contingency is trauma-informed because it really establishes expectations. Again, it reduces that uncertainty that they might not know. We also have this real piece of community that's brought in when anytime we do anything that's class-wide, right? So all students are then part of that acknowledgement system, right? So when students need more acknowledgement, more attention within the classroom, this helps to give that as well. When I look at the supplemental resources that I have here for you, here are some suggestions. Here we see 2 objectives, one that is an academic objective and one that's for social emotional learning that's being worked on. I really like this graphic. It's helping me understand the continuum of strategies. It moves towards more intensive, right? So if I start with planned ignoring, and then I move to physical proximity, and then I give direct eye contact, give a signal or a cue, then I praise the appropriate behavior in others. Maybe then I do a redirect or a reteach, or I give praise approximations, or I could do specific error correction, provide choice, and then a conference with the student. This alone, as an educator, helps me remember that I have an entire set of strategies to work through and to be very intentional and incremental in when I, expedite any sort of response. This one is hard for myself. I find myself with my 3 children at home wanting to say calm down all the time, and I realize that no one is less calm when you say calm down. So I really like this list of thinking about alternatives to say when someone is in a triggered state or agitated. And here's some more. We also have some validation here, right? And when students say things to us, whether we're a teacher or a counselor, and it's not so much about the academics, we kind of tend to just go on autopilot to respond, right? We want to make sure that students' feelings are validated. Rather than denying they exist, we want to honor the way that students are feeling. So we really want to try to validate their response. So here's an example. If the student says, I can't do anything right, it's kind of sometimes our knee-jerk reaction to say, that's not true. But if they're really feeling that way, we can validate their response to say, it must feel frustrating to feel like you never do anything right. And that kind of changes it a little bit because we're allowing the student to sit and we're listening very closely to them. Here again is that 15 seconds of your time to build relationship. And here are the resources we have for class-wide group contingency. Okay, so believe it or not, that was 8 different strategies that are trauma-informed. Hopefully you've had some time to reflect on your reflection sheet about what you already do, what you're going to implement with more intentionality, and then what will you add to your classroom management practices. So that is all of the content that I have for you, and I have spoken at you for a very long time. So I'm happy to let you go because it is our last session together for the day, or you are welcome to stick around and have a chat. I'm going to end the recording so that we can have some discussion that best meets your needs. I do want to thank you for being here today to talk about trauma-informed classroom strategies at the Summer Institute. Have a wonderful rest of the day and a great rest of the Summer Institute. Best of luck this school year. You know where to find us.